the team at the DG Klima in charge of preparing legislation for CO2 emissions for heavy-duty vehicles in January 2017. He has worked for more than 20 years at various commission services responsible for automotive legislation, pressure equipment legislation, and the management of research projects. And he holds a PhD in physics, and he has studied at the universities of Regensburg, Munich, and Boulder, Colorado. Nikolaus, thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, thanks for the opportunity to present our proposal. Okay, now what you will be seeing and hearing now is is there? The micro. Okay, so it sounds okay. What I will present now is actually the follow-up of the work of Georgos at the JSC. JSC did much of the preparation work for a proposal of DG Klima and the European Commission on CO2 performance standards of new heavy-duty vehicles. Actually, what will I be talking about today is, first of all, I will give you a short explanation of the narrative of the proposal. Why are we doing the proposal, and what's the, so to say, the motivation and the main economic parameters which are there. And then I will go more into technicalities of the proposal. So I will really try to present you how that works. I will present vehicle subgroups which we have generated, which we have defined, manufacturer-specific CO2 targets, incentives and the CO2 emissions and the targets, which is the main part, of course, of the proposal, the mechanics on how this is distributed, and then a few particular things like incentive mechanisms for zero and low emission vehicles, banking and borrowing, governance, and the adjustments to changes in the vector system. Okay, the narrative. What's the reason here? Why are we making such a proposal? If we look at, you know that the European community, the European Union has committed to reduce the CO2 emissions in the transport sector by 25% in the year of 2030 with respect to the 2005 emissions in the road transport sector. For this objective, certain steps have been taken. I would say we are on the right track in the light-duty sector, in the passenger cars and light vans area, in particular with a new proposal which has been made end of last year. But also the heavy-duty sector has to make its contribution, because without that we won't arrive there if we don't reduce the emissions in the heavy-duty sector. And here you see the evolution, the projected evolution in the heavy-duty sector if there would be no action. So to say, this would be the normal evolution expected just due to autonomous, this includes autonomous improvements of the energy efficiency of the trucks and of the heavy-duty sector, of the heavy-duty vehicles, but also the higher transport demand. Okay, you see we are going slightly up, but we would have to go down by about 20, between something like 15 and 20%. So we have to act here in the heavy-duty sector. That's one reason. The second reason here in the heavy-duty sector, which is particularly important here in the heavy-duty sector, more than in the light-duty sector, is here the cost considerations. We can achieve with relatively, so to say, simple improvements in the technologies and deployment of technologies on the heavy-duty sector, a significant reduction of the fuel consumption, which immediately reflects, of course, in lower operating costs by the operators, which are typically small and medium-sized companies, and also a reduction of logistic costs of transport. And you can see here a bit the distribution of the operational costs, typical operational costs in the road transport sector. Fuel is here a significant part, and the fuel costs can be reduced by, on the right-hand side, you have a few technologies which can contribute, and where the reduction of the fuel costs already for the first owner within the first 4 or 5 years of ownership by far exceed the cost of technology. So this is a second important argument that we have to realize these cost savings for the operators of heavy-duty vehicles. And this gives you a short overview. I won't spend too much time on that, but that gives you an overview on what kind of regulations we have in other world regions already on heavy-duty. And you can see that in practically all major regions, we have already, since a few years, regulation of heavy-duty CO2 emissions in place. Of course, now we can wonder, if you look, for instance, to the regulations in China and India, these would be very soft regulations with respect to European standards. I mean, in principle, they would, if applied to Europe, they would effectively just impose the status quo, or even a bit less than the status quo. So they would not necessarily live up to our ambition level or what we would expect, but there is regulation in place and which can also be gradually improved over time. And in particular, the regulation in the US, in North America, is very serious and very demanding for the I would say, and really enforces the deployment of new technologies, and was in a way also a bit the blueprint. I wouldn't say that it was exactly what we wanted to copy, but it was a bit an example which gave us some guidance for developing our regulations. Now, where does the proposal fit into the general political picture? You probably know that the European Union has since the second half of 2017 published or adopted 3 so-called mobility packages. These are 3 packages of each of them is a package of several regulatory measures in the road sector, in the transport sector, which in fact concerns regulatory measures addressing fuel quality, addressing the charging road transport, the charging of the road charges, taxes, limitations to taxes, like the Eurovignette, public procurement, CO2 emission limits for light-duty vehicles, and now also the CO2 emissions for heavy-duty vehicles. 3 different mobility packages. The first one adopted in May 2017, the second one in November 2017, and the third one now in May 2018. And our HDV CO2 proposal was in the third mobility package, and that gives you a certain overview. Now, what do we expect from the proposal? First of all, we will get in the period of within the next 10 years. This is, I would say, the main effective period of the proposal. You now may wonder why would it already be effective in 2020. We expect already some effects because we have some early adoption mechanisms and so, which should already bring down the emissions there. We expect a reduction of 54 million tons of CO2 in the period, in this 10 years period, and this is equivalent to the total annual emissions of Sweden. So, okay, here we are talking about 10 years effect of the proposals and just 1 year of Sweden. Savings, we have significant savings at the pump of transport operators. We would have a vehicle which is bought and compliant with the regulation in 2025. So which shows the reduction potential we would like to mandate would show about 25,000 euros of fuel savings within the first 5 years as compared to a typical vehicle which is on the market today, a typical heavy-duty vehicle. So significant savings. The oil import savings of the European Union would be delivery truck. The effect of an exceedance of CO2 emissions for these regional delivery trucks on the global CO2 emissions is much less than if I look to a long-haul truck, because the long-haul truck typically has a much higher mileage and payload. And this is taken into account by this so-called mileage and payload weighting factor, which ensures that in the total sum, the CO2 emissions, the utility-specific CO2 emissions of the vehicles in the subgroups which are used a lot, which have a high mileage and a high payload, count more than those of the subgroups where you have a low mileage and low payload. Okay, so this is just a short summary, more for when you will look at it back home. It gives you the 2 building blocks. We have the manufacturer-specific emission targets. We have the average specific CO2 emissions of a manufacturer. Structure is very similar. We have several elements which are calculated, and then they are compared to each other for compliance. Now, maybe a few words on the incentives and on other structural elements which are part of the proposal. The first is the zero and low emission vehicles. How are they defined? Zero and low emission vehicles are defined in a way which do not depend on vector simulations, because for the moment zero and low emissions vehicles cannot be simulated by vector. They are based, either they have no combustion engine or they have an internal combustion engine which emits less than 1 gram CO2 per kilowatt hour which is defined actually on the engine certification mainly. No? So this is an independent certification. Low emission heavy duty vehicles are in principle vehicles which are no zero emission vehicles, meaning which have a combustion engine, but which have very low CO2 emissions. This would be typically something like plug-in hybrids, which don't exist yet, but just anticipating the possible arrival of these vehicles. Now, what are the incentives which we are going to grant? First of all, we give the so-called, we give certain incentives in the weighted sum. The zero and low emission vehicles are counted multiple times. So it's, if you wish, what we call typically as super credits for the purpose of determining the average specific emissions. Zero emission vehicles are counted 2 times, low emission vehicles are counted up to 2 times according to a certain formula that takes into account in a linear manner the real CO2 emissions. We have a cap. The total effect of the reduction of zero and low emission vehicles can only be by up to a maximum of 3%. We should also be aware that in the sum for zero and low emission vehicles, also vehicles which are not regulated by the current standard, heavy duty vehicles, such as buses or smaller trucks, can be considered. There you have a special scheme and you have a subcap. This subcap is a maximum of 1.5%. So we can have a reduction of this total CO2 emissions of a manufacturer by up to 1.5% due to the effect of low emission for instance, electric buses or electric smaller trucks not covered by the regulation, which are marketed by these manufacturers. By the way, I have added in the slides, you have backup slides where all the formulas are explained a bit more in detail, so you can look at this at home and can also come back with questions if there are some questions of understanding. Then we have the banking and borrowing scheme. The banking and borrowing scheme ensures a certain flexibility for compliance in the different years. So the manufacturer may exceed within this fleet the emission target in a specific year by a certain extent if he can compensate it and can compensate it by an overachievement in another year. First of all, we have in the years of 2019 to 2024 a so-called early reward emission credit schemes. And it works like that you have to have, if you have less CO2 emissions compared to a certain emission trajectory, which is a linear connection of the 2019 monitoring data and the 2025 target, you can acquire credits. This early rewards, this early achievement, I would say early adoption credits, can be used for compliance in the 2025 target. So if you are, let's say in the year 2019, better than the average of all manufacturers with your CO2 emissions, you can acquire credits and you can use them for compliance in 2025. So you get 1 year more, so to say, you have, so to say, a bit of a grace period of 1 year to of compliance if you have acquired in the early adoption period some credits. Similar in the year 2025 and to 2029. There you have a emission trajectory which connects, so to say, the 2025 to the 2030 target. And if you are better than below this emission trajectory with your emissions, CO2 emissions in 1 year, you can use them for compliance in another year. Here you see a bit how it works. In the first period, you just have an emission trajectory. You only can get credits. In the second year, you have a target and an emission trajectory. If you are below the emission trajectory in the given year, you acquire credits. If above the target, you acquire, so to say, depth. And at the end of the day, you have to in the year 2029, the total balance of credits and depth is considered. So now what happens if, despite of all these flexibilities, there is still an exceedance? We have penalties. Of course, at a certain point, we have to come to that. Penalties are applied if, in 2 cases, first of all, if in a given year, in the year 2025 to 2028, the emission target, the specific emission target of the manufacturer is exceeded by more than 5%. And the second case is if in the year 2029, the total depth acquired until that year exceed the emission credits according to a code process. Again, all the formulas are, of course, in the regulation, and you also find them explained in the backup slides. And then you have a certain premium, a certain excess emission premium is applied, and these are 6,800 euros per gram of CO2 per ton kilometer multiplied by the excess emissions calculated according to this scheme. This actually, how did we come to this emission premium? It was calculated by a kind of equivalence calculation by considering what is the total lifetime effect on the CO2 emissions of a certain exceedance in the light-duty sector as compared to the same exceedance in the heavy-duty sector. In light-duty sector, we have 1 gram of CO2 costs 95 euros. 1 gram of CO2 per kilometer costs 95 euros, and we have applied here the same principle to the heavy-duty sector, and then we come to this formula, to this value. Governance, we have a few other elements in the proposal. We have the obligation to the Commission to monitor the gap between real world and certified emissions data. For that purpose, the Commission has the entitlement to introduce certain measures like mandating fuel consumption meters and load meters in trucks through technical measures. It would happen to type approval regulation, and also to collect this data. We also have certain entitlements for market surveillance measures like setting up in-service conformity test procedures and correction mechanisms in case of deviation. Then adjustment to reference emissions. I will be very short on that. You find also the formulas more in the annex. We have, of course, here a particular challenge. We know that the vector simulation and the whole certification procedure is very recent. It's very young, and it may not be fully stable yet. So we may have still changes on the fly within the coming years, hopefully not too many and hopefully not too radical ones, to the vector and the certification procedure. And then, of course, if this happens after the year 2019, we would have the situation that we would have to compare CO2 emissions, which have been calculated with the old vector versions in the year 2019, to CO2 emissions calculated with an updated vector version. And then we have a certain procedure on how the 2019 CO2 emissions are corrected for. We have a certain correction mechanism. And this is defined, this adjustment procedure is defined in the annex. We have, in principle, 2 adjustment procedures. One of them is for the simple one, when just the payload values change. There we can just apply a straightforward application. And we have another one which is more complex. If certain provisions, for instance, in the emission profile in the driving tracer so change, then it is more complex. You also find the details in the backup slides and, of course, in the regulation. Then we have here the obligations of the Commission to publish performance. This is just standard. It's like in the light duty. We have a number of elements which are determined according to the regulation have to be published, always until the 31st of October of each year, of each following year, after this data have been collected. And now here you find more information on the third mobility package, more the political issues, and then on the specific HDV policies in our proposals, also including frequently asked questions. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Nikolaus. If you would like to sit and join us for this panel, we'd like to open for questions. Does anyone have any questions to any of our first 2 speakers? There's one here, so a microphone's coming. Just state your name and company, please.
Yeah, hello everybody. Volker Hasenberg is my name from Daimler. I have a question to you, Georgios, regarding the engine efficiency you've shown us with your projection by 2025. I'm not sure whether I understood it correctly. So as far as I interpret your presentation is that you assume an average engine efficiency over the entire fleet by about 50% in 2025. Is that right?
No. Maybe I did not explain that very well. So what the assumption was, we know from the sample we got what is the average efficiency, average, not peak efficiency, in the 2016 fleet. Yeah. So we kept the engines that were on the, we split that in 2. Yeah. So we kept the top 50%. So these engines, we assume that will survive up to 2025. So 50% of what is already there, the top 50 performers, 50% of the performers will survive. And the rest of the 50% will be replaced by new technology that is going to be more efficient, up to roughly 8%. Now, it doesn't mean that the rest of the 50% is uniformly 8% higher. The majority is less, but there is a, if you see, it's a sigmoid. Yeah. So few engines are up to 8%, exhibit up to 8% higher efficiency. This corresponds roughly to the assumption of 50% peak efficiency, an assumption that appears in several documents and has been claimed by various OEMs. So there is a small percentage, between 5 and 10%, if I remember correct, that is on average 48%, exhibits a 48% efficiency, and the majority is somewhere between 45 and 47.5.
Today or in,
no,
in
2025. 2025.
Okay.
Today it's shifted. Today the peak average efficiency that we observed was around 45%.
Then sorry, but then I didn't get you
I think it's easy
correctly.
if we
So
go to the
when you see the average is 45, then just this, and then I'm finished. And you say you have an improvement of 8 percentage points from, and you end up by 48. Then you have a starting point at 40.
We have a starting point of 40.
From 40% of engine efficiency on an average, when you have an improvement of 8 percentage points.
It's not that we go from 40 to 48. It's that we go from 44 or 45 to 48. If you make the division, this should give you roughly 8%.
Okay. Maybe we discuss it later in the break. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Would you like me to put the...
No, it's okay. If we
Is
have
it okay?
other questions.
Good. Are there any other questions? Okay, there's one over there.
Good morning, Aldo Celasco from ASEA. I have a question for Georgios and one comment from Klaus, if I may. For Georgios, in the conclusion of your presentation, you indicate 15% of ambition level for 2025. I also noted that you indicate that an average of 1% yearly reduction is a correct value. If I count from the baseline 2018 to 2025, we have only 6 years. How you achieve 15%? So if you consider one yearly reduction.
Yeah, well, what I said is that our scenario more or less confirmed that there should be, in any case, an annual improvement, roughly 1 point something percent. It depends on the assumptions and the vehicle category and many things. So that would mean that in 6 years you would have a baseline improvement of roughly 7%, right, or 8%, something like that. So the ambition put by what Klaus presented actually less than doubles that, or doubles that. But in our analysis, we did not consider the introduction of some technologies that have very promising potentials. If you see, there is no assumption on the ADAS, predictive cruise control, there is no assumption on improved auxiliaries, there is no assumption on a radical body redesign, so our air drag improvement is up to 1%, if not even less. Even with tires, if you were just willing to invest more and subsidize somehow a higher tire class, so shifting all these tires that I presented from D or C to B, you would bridge that gap. So technically speaking, and purely from a technical perspective, I did not discuss about costs. Klaus knows about costs much better. It is feasible, because we got some feedback from some experts and member state representatives that if this value that the Commission suggested is actually plausible. So we answered to that. It's our answer to that question mainly, that it is plausible.
Okay. Thank you. Have a comment.
The comment to Klaus is related to the penalties. 6,800 per vehicle, if I may, it's very high value if you compare also to the light commercial vehicle, as you mentioned before. Please consider that it's a very huge amount, again 6,800. Can you comment that or again, Klaus, because I didn't get very well your justification for this value.
Okay, I mean, first of all, the amount by itself is not, I mean, in principle doesn't mean anything because you have to see with what it is multiplied. And of course, in the case of light-duty vehicles, we multiply this by the exceedance of grams per kilometer, and here we multiply it by the exceedance in terms of grams per ton kilometer. The grams of ton kilometer are typically for heavy-duty vehicles in the order of 70 to 80 grams per ton kilometer for heavy-duty vehicles. The grams per kilometer are for a light-duty vehicle in the order of around 100 grams per kilometer. And for a heavy-duty vehicles, that would be much more. No? The values per gram per ton per kilometer. So already from the fact that we changed the metric, the number becomes by definition higher than it would be if we had formulated that value in terms of grams per kilometer. In per euro per grams in euro per exceedances of CO2 per kilometer. If we formulated that in euros per exceedances of grams CO2 per kilometer, this would be 570 euros per exceedance of 1 gram of CO2 per kilometer. This is also higher than the light duty, of course. 570 is more than 95, but we are talking here about vehicles which have, first of all, a higher value than the light duty vehicles, and we are also talking about vehicles where 1 gram of exceedance has a higher effect over the lifetime, because the vehicles, the heavy-duty vehicles of long haul, for instance, they have about 6 times the lifetime mileage than a light-duty vehicle has. And also the profits a vehicle manufacturer makes from the sale of such a vehicle are significantly higher than those from a light-duty vehicle. So we believe we have calculated these values, and of course penalties are there not to be paid to ensure that vehicle manufacturers are compliant with the regulation. It is not our intention to gain our salaries from these penalties. We would like the best regulation is which avoids the penalties to be applied. And then of course you have to check, once you have defined these penalties, whether the penalties ensure that you have to look at the cost functions, at the cost curves, whether the marginal cost curves, the marginal costs, meaning improving the vehicles just at the borderline where we achieve the regulation, it should still be more cost efficient to improve the vehicle than the penalty which is being paid. And we have, can see this in the impact assessment, this condition is fulfilled. So we are on the safe side. But of course, it is obvious that the details of the penalties, I mean, a penalty is not, you have certain elements, you can calculate it according to certain principles, but it is not mathematically 100% accurate procedure which you apply. There's a certain approach you choose, a certain political judgment, and I would expect that this penalty, the size of the penalty within certain limits will still be now also one element of discussion in the ongoing co-decision process.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, there's another one. Just before, if you don't mind, I just had one question that is quite in the same topic, so if I can first. One thing, when you were describing the process for the rules and how penalties and banking borrowing are going to work, it's to some extent quite comparable to the light-duty targets. Of course, there are differences because we're talking about trucks and not cars. The only thing that is in the light-duty target, and you haven't mentioned anything, is the fact that manufacturers can pool and group to each other to achieve to achieve targets. Is there any pooling considerations in the heavy-duty policy?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, this element was investigated also in the impact assessment, and we came to the conclusion that pooling is here not appropriate because we have a very limited number of manufacturers. We only have 6, maybe very soon only 5. And that would not justify setting up here a pooling mechanism, because that would actually intrinsically incorporate the risk of a cartel, and would be potentially there would be a risk with competition regulation that we are coming into conflict with.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Nikolaus. Yeah, so question.
Good morning. My name is Pablo Mendoza. I'm from Iveco. Just 3 questions for Georgios. The first one is there a plan from the Commission to take into consideration strategies to reduce fuel consumption and CO2, like platooning, like biofuels, that are not included in Vector right now? And it's difficult to think how you can take this into consideration, but I hope you are also thinking of that. Then the second question, same line, what is the reference document that you use for the properties of the fuels? For these biofuels in the future. And the third question is, for the future as well, innovative technologies. Imagine that I have a technology that I want to implement in the market in 3 years or 4 years. What is going to be the procedure that I will have to follow? First, not to put in, say, in terms of confidentiality, I wouldn't like to go forward and publish everything about this technology, but to work together with the Commission to implement this in Vector somehow before actually launching it into the market. Then how this is going to be managed in a sense, and how am I going to be able to get some benefit from these technologies? Thank you.
Okay, considering that we used to be colleagues, he was working to the office next to mine. Thank you very much. No, I'm joking. Thank you very much, Pablo. Actually, I will give you some answers based on my personal opinion and without wanting to represent the Commission. And I will leave it to Klaus because they are the main policy DG, so I don't want to enter in your field, Klaus. So, about fuels, as JRC, we're participating in a joint collaboration with you, and by you I mean ASEA, that is UCAR, and we have the famous well-to-wheel analysis. So at any point in time, if and the well-to-wheel analysis in the recent years has been expanded to cover also heavy duties. So if at any point in time we would like to dig further into the fuels, their properties and their potential, and maybe discuss about a well-to-tank approach as well, the basis is there. So I would start from there. Now, if politically or regulatory this is feasible in the next years, it's an answer to be given by basically Klaus. Scientifically, the basis is there. About future technologies, I understand the point. It hints to the famous eco-innovations that we have for passenger cars. It's a scheme that I'm not very fond of. I understand its benefits, but in the case of passenger cars, we have a very strictly defined testing protocol that is totally different from what we have in the case of heavy duties. In the case of heavy duties, we have introduced the concept of components measurement. We have a very hectic procedures for how we measure air drag or axle efficiency or gearbox efficiency with an engine itself. I would really love to understand what is this super special technology that cannot be somehow measured and introduced in Vector. I mean, I know that the industry uses simulation for evaluating almost everything, so even if it is not now in Vector and it is something that has substantial potential, I believe that we could accommodate it with some work. And if we cannot, maybe we can come up with some defensible reduction rates, cycle-specific or vehicle-specific reduction rates for the future very easily. So I don't personally see the need for an eco-innovation scheme whatsoever in the case of heavy duties. But that's, again, my scientific personal opinion. About the third one, what was the fuels? Platooning. Platooning, it's something that is completely out of, well, I understand and I know the potential for having these platoons or even road trains as they do in Australia, but this is a matter of safety as well, and if the infrastructure in Europe is ready to accommodate that, and I believe that a colleague from DG Move would be more appropriate to answer this. I don't know. In principle, I'm not against it. I see that it could be accommodated even by Vector with some basic assumption on the influence of, on air drag, but there are other elements to be considered that I'm personally not aware of. I mean, are these feasible in, throughout Europe? I can think of some roads in my home country, that being Greece, that it would be very awkward to see such a such a solution. But I don't know, Klaus, would you like to?
Maybe I can say a few words. It's exactly as you say. Now, for platooning, we have currently two challenges which are related to safety and also the technical provisions. We need, first of all, the necessary road safety, roadworthiness regulation, which is in the hands of DG Move. They are considering it, preparing it, that it should be made possible under certain conditions. And secondly, it's type approval regulation, because you need to define the communication protocols in a safe manner, also that the vehicles function in a safe, we have a kind of autonomous driving, it's a kind of simplified autonomous driving which you have for platooning, and you need to do that. And also I've learned last week that DG Grow is working intensely for that, and they will roll out the necessary type approval procedures in the next 2 or 3 years to come. It's foreseen in the proposal for the general safety regulation, which for the revision of the general safety regulation, which was actually also a part of the third mobility package, which I should have mentioned and I didn't. No? But it's an important element of DG Grow, and they are developing that. Now, if this is there, okay, what would happen in vector? I think we would have to see this also somewhere in vector. I mean, for me, it's a bit, I have maybe a bit of a simplistic view. I would say if a vehicle is then capable of doing platooning, and we have sufficient statistical evidence that platooning is actually used, then the air drag could be for this particular vehicle on at least a part of the mission profiles could be reduced by a certain amount. No? So it's not really vector challenge to introduce that. No? It's just that you have all the boundary conditions fulfilled.
It's more likely, it's more an issue of defending any reduction and proving it rather than implementing it. I think the implementation part is the easy part in this case.
Okay. Excellent. Thanks. We've got time for one final question. Does anyone want to make any final questions? So one final question here. Microphone's coming.
Thank you. I make it this time short. Just one comment to the penalties. Klaus, you're totally right. You have a correct derived number from the PESCA fines, but when you compare the direct exceedance, so for example 1% exceedance of the limit, then you end up by roughly €100 per vehicle regarding the passenger cars, and regarding the trucks you end up by roughly €3,000, so 30 times higher. And this is nevertheless, yes, it will consume more fuel, emitting more CO2, driving longer, that's right, but 30 times higher than the PESCA, this is pretty much. Thank you.
Okay. Any comments?
Okay, maybe a very last comment on that. We have here two routes. No? You have, I mean, to come to a penalty, you can use the environmental route and you can use the economic route. And we discussed that a lot when preparing the proposal, and at the end of the day, maybe you have to choose something in between or you have to combine both. Since we didn't get any input from the vehicle manufacturers on the economic route, we chose the environmental route, because there we knew what we have, and I think we have now figured out there we can be justified from the environmental impact grounds. If there are concerns on the economic effects, like the ones you have mentioned, they have now to be fed into the co-decision process, and they have to be discussed there together with the environmental route, I would say. No?